30 years ago look like California right now, like downtown. You go down to like the library. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, it's like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's
in the
it's
library.
unbelievable. It's in the library. I mean, you should do a total segment on the library, a public library downtown Los Angeles, and I'm telling you, it's unbelievable. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah.
In Sweden, the government is forcing preschools to be gender neutral. Yes, it's just as crazy as it sounds. A school ignoring basic biology. Children in Sweden can go to preschool as young as 1 year old. In these government-mandated gender-neutral classrooms for tots, teachers hold training events to indoctrinate toddlers in radical, progressive, anti-science gender theory. Training events. When you say communist social engineering, can you say creepy?
When you look at who is the power base behind gender ideology, these groups are the ones with the power. They are the ones with the money, whether it comes from the government or whether it comes from George Soros, who has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to promote this ideology is to destroy man and woman marriage, destroy the family, and once you destroy gender, you have no basis for man-woman family. So this is a definite political attempt to completely eradicate the basis for man-woman marriage and gender, because once that's destroyed, you have no foundation.
It's social engineering, but it's worse. The students aren't allowed to say boys and girls. They're only allowed to say friends. Does that ring a familiar bell, comrade? They aren't allowed to use gender-specific pronouns like he or she. They're indoctrinated only to use gender-neutral pronouns like hen. If the little girls are too girly and the little boys too boyish, teachers reprimand the parents for, quote, gender mistreatment.
The school is not the place to indoctrinate kids into changing genders or giving them books to show them that they need to change genders or that there's all these things going on.
See, this is part of the progressive agenda. Replace God with government. Tear the family apart by sabotaging marriage. Tear marriage apart by redefining institutions that have existed in our world for thousands of years.
Perhaps that's why the left is so determined in this country to get Christianity out of the classroom. But tell us something of the chilling...
There's no doubt that's why they're determined. I mean, people like Derrida, he called the West phallogos-centric, right? Male-dominated, logos-centric. It's like, that is the West. It's logos-centric. If you want to take the West down, you remove the idea of the divine word from the substructure of the society. So you have to do that. It's like, and this is the level at which this war is being fought. It's fundamentally a theological war.
Interesting.
People don't like to think that, but... Freedom of speech. You say, well, speech is... The right to freedom of speech is central because it's the right by which you defend all the other rights. Well, that's why the idea of logos in the West is the most sacred concept, right? So Christ, you think about this psychologically, Christ is the ideal of perfection. Now, this is independent of any religious discussion or any historical accuracy. It doesn't matter. What Christ represents is the perfect individual, whatever that is. Now, you can discuss endlessly what that is. But one of the things the West has settled on is the idea, that the perfect individual utters the truthful speech that makes potential into habitable order. Does that through truth. And that's embedded in the first few sentences in Genesis, for example, when God brings the world into being. So, and the idea that truthful speech that brings the world into being from formless potential also characterizes each person. That's our fabrication in the image of God. That's the idea of the West. It's an unbelievably remarkable idea that perfection, individual perfection, is to be found in a relationship with spoken truth. God, that's the great idea. Well, it's out of that arises the observation that there's nothing more central to the hierarchy of rights and obligations as well, let's say, than freedom of speech. Yes, it's absolutely central. That's why Christ is the Word made flesh. The idea is that the perfect individual is the person who speaks truth, but also acts out the truth of those words. It's a proposition whose merit is virtually self-evident when you understand it in that manner. So yeah, to see assaults on freedom of speech, especially compelled speech, well, that's where I drew the line.
And what I realize now in looking back, because now I have 73 years of history of real life experience of dealing with transgender issues on some level, whether it's the experience of being a child who felt like he should have been a different gender, or going through the teen years and adult years and eventually undergoing surgery. What I realize is that the worst thing that happened to me was being affirmed by my grandmother, in that the idea was that there was something wrong with being a boy. And so when you begin to affirm someone in the opposite gender, it's a bigger picture than that, because what you're really saying is there's something wrong with who you are. So how do you fix that? And once that seed was planted in me, I call today the seed of gender dysphoria, as it grew, it began to take over my thinking, and it began to play in my head every moment of the day. It was like having a radio on that would never stop playing, that just continued to tell me that I was born in the wrong body, or that there was something wrong with me as a boy. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if Grandma would have just sat me down and said, "Walt, you're a very handsome young man. You don't need to change genders. Let me affirm you as a young boy. Let me help you realize who you are." But that did not happen. And it's not happening today.
And I read his book, The Gulag Archipelago. Here is this man who describes the horrors of being a political prisoner because he disagrees. He converted. He was originally a supporter of communism. He came to see how evil it was and how oppressive it was. He was imprisoned for having a different view to the state-ordained insistence that everything was terrific. And he writes unbelievably that lying on his prison bunk one day, listening to the guards beat up a fellow prisoner, the screams and the yells, he found freedom when he realised the dividing line between good and evil, in fact, didn't lie between captor and captive. In fact, the jailers were captive too, to a system, to a blind ideology, to an inability to
Well,
think
most of them were
freely.
trustees, so they were perpetrating the very system that imprisoned them.
Not between Catholic and Baptist, he wrote, not between woman and man, not between black and white. But the dividing line between evil actually lies somewhere across every human heart. Plainly, you believe it's incredibly important that we understand that. It comes back to what you said. I think when it's framed, we understand it.
Everyone knows that.
Everyone knows
If
it.
they think, because all they have to do is think about their own transgressions. I mean, if you ask someone to sit for 5 minutes and think, okay, well, what mistakes have you made in your life? It's like, that'll come up pretty quickly. And you can even ask people, well, what terrible, unforgivable mistakes have you made in your life? Like, yeah, well, we know about those too. It's like, it's no one's so naive, you know, unless they've really wrestled intensely against themselves. There's virtually no one so naive to not be able to answer those questions.
Are we doing our children a massive disservice by trying to imply that there's nothing wrong with them, no need for guilt, no need for shame, no need to come to grips with evil?
This is so...
Because the problem's the environment?
Well, one of the things that's so funny about what's happened...
The problem is that we've just got to fix society, fix the institutions,
Well...
and then all this will disappear.
Psychologists have been... Not all psychologists, obviously, but the psychological profession is neck deep in this pathology, has been beating the self-esteem drum for 50 years. Oh no, you're okay. You should feel good about yourself. Like, you're fine the way you are. It's like you think, well, that's a calming message for people. It's like, no, it's not. It's not at all. And I watch my audiences. It's like, it's full of people in the audience who think, I'm suffering a lot more than I think is tenable. A whole bunch of it's my fault. My life is not in the order it should be. I know I'm doing 50 things wrong. It's like, what the hell's wrong with me? What's wrong with the people around me? This is really serious. And some, well-meaning person comes up and says, you're okay just the way you are. It's like, no one wants that message. It's like, no, I'm not okay the way I am. If you're a mess, you know it, obviously. You're suffering away like so much you can barely tolerate it. It's like, that's okay. You can do something about it.
So
And
you're-
that's the thing that turns the lights on. It's like, you can do something about it. It's like, oh.
So they're in a freezing prison